So to misquote a once popular song, I got 100 million reasons to study this beetle, and all of them are dollar bills. $100 million every year. That's how much damage this beetle, the striped cucumber beetle, inflicts on American crops. Now they focus on a family of crops called the cucurbits, which includes cucumbers, melons, and squash. And these crops make up almost 50% of Kentucky vegetable production. So local farmers are especially interested in improving our current ways of dealing with this beetle pest. Now, one of the main ways they do that is through what we call monitoring traps. And the yellow sticky trap shown here is the most common example of that. And this is effectively a yellow piece of flypaper on a stake. Farmers will place them throughout their fields and check them periodically. And the number of beetles on this trap tells them when they need to apply pesticides to knock the beetle population back down. But this trap has flaws. It's single use, it's expensive, and it attracts and kills pollinators. So back in the summer of 2017, my job was to develop a superior alternative. So I went through home gardening forums and synthesized the best of the designs I saw into what I call the modified funnel trap. Now this is a reusable trap, it is cost effective, and it is a modular system, which means it can be loaded with different chemical attractants depending on what the farmer is trying to do. So once I had designed this trap, I had to test it in the field. So throughout the summer of 2017, I tested the new modified funnel trap versus the yellow sticky trap on a field of organic squash at the University of Kentucky Research Farm. Now, both of these trap sets were placed in the field for 3 24-hour periods, and this graph shows our results. The y-axis is the total number of beetles captured over all 3 of those 24-hour periods, and the x-axis is the trap variations. So for the sticky traps, we tested them both inside the field and outside of the field. For the modified funnel traps, we had a control with no chemical attractant, one with a commercial cucumber beetle lure, one with powder cucurbitacin bait, which is the chemical in the plants that the beetles are attracted to, and one with both the lure and the bait. Now that's a lot of information on one graph, but what you need to focus on is this bar right here. We certainly did. See, we set out to build a monitoring trap, but the modified funnel trap with the lure out-captured the sticky traps by a factor of 400% as effective. And that opened up an entire new possibility for this trap as an independent control method for these beetles in small gardens, which would reduce the amount of pesticides home farmers need to apply to their crops and all the negative environmental effects that come with it. So in 2018, I designed a follow-up study to test that possibility. I recruited 24 gardens throughout Lexington and split them up into 2 cohorts. Cohort number 1 was 17 home gardens with between 5 and 10 plants. Cohort number 2 was 7 community gardens with between 10 and 40 plants. And throughout the months of May through September, I placed one of the modified funnel traps with the lure, the most effective one of 2017, into each of these gardens and cycled them weekly. And every time I visited the gardens, I did a brief visual survey to determine the beetle predation pressure and damage on these plants. So this is a graph for 2018. As you can see from the y-axis, we had a fairly low capture rate for these gardens. I believe that's because these gardens are small. They're not going to have as many plants. They're not going to attract the beetles as well as something larger would. We did see a higher capture rate on the community gardens, which would make sense. They have more plants. There's going to be more attraction pressure for these beetles. And the existence of 2 generational spikes indicates that these traps are sensitive to the background beetle population in the field. So my research has taken kind of an interesting turn from when I first started out. In a monitoring trap sense, we need a future study on a larger field to test, to get enough statistically significant data to determine its use as a monitoring tool. But as a control trap, we are zeroing in on exactly how best to use this. Next field season, I intend to test this trap in a small monoculture organic field, something smaller than the research farm I used in the first year of studies, and something larger than the home gardens I used in the last year of studies. If we get the right-sized field with this trap, it could serve as a very viable alternative to pesticide use and provide local farmers with an environmentally friendly, pollinator-free, and economically beneficial alternative to pesticide applications and reduce the negative environmental impacts of over-application of pesticides and help the farmers protect their crops more effectively. I'm excited to see where this trap goes in the future, and I hope you are too. Thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions you may have.
Hidden away on the shelves of the Special Collections Library a mystery sat unnoticed for over 4 decades. And this mystery was MS Latin Kentuckiensis 3, which is the manuscript you see before you. This manuscript is a 15th century daily prayer book from Italy called the Book of Hours, which was used to pray a set of prayers known as the Divine Office. These books were prized possessions of those who owned them, and they were known for the high quality of their materials as well as the hundreds of hours of manpower it was taking to make them. When I first looked at this manuscript, I noticed the same thing. It had beautiful handwritten text and amazing illuminations. But while I was examining it, I noticed something pretty unusual. The first 3 pages, known as the Endpapers, numbered 1, 2, and 3 up here, were remarkably different. The first thing that I noticed was that they were oriented the completely wrong way to be read from a left to right orientation. They were made of a dirtier, kind of older looking vellum, and they were cut in order to fit the size of the book. You can see on this diagram here where in the book they were located. Included inside the front cover, which is known as the paste down, and then on the front and back side of the first page, which is known as the flyleaf. In contrast, the first page of the actual Book of Hours, number 4, was made of a creamier, nicer looking vellum. It had fancier red text and gold illuminations, and of course, it was easy to read. I was able to identify this page as a calendar of saints' feast days for the months of January and February, very common for these sorts of books. As for the fragments, the Endpapers, they were obviously a part of a completely different document. So I went to the previous scholarship on this manuscript, but I found that no one in the previous 4 decades of UK's ownership of this book had ever said anything about these Endpapers or the identification of the text. It was a complete mystery. And it was a mystery that I was determined to solve for myself. I spent many weeks in the library carefully deciphering each line of this text, made more difficult by the fact that it's in heavily abbreviated medieval Latin, and again, the lines were cut in half sometimes. And so every time I had a piece of usable text, I would plug it into a database of digitized Christian texts, hoping against hope that it would spit back a match. And one day, after many hours, it finally gave me back a document. I took the document it gave me and I compared it to the fragment text, and I found that there was over a 90% match between these texts. And in a moment that I can only really say is the most exciting of my undergraduate career, I was able to conclusively identify the fragment text. It was part of a commentary by St. Jerome, more specifically his commentary and the 6th book of said commentary on the book of the prophet Jeremiah in the Bible. Now, St. Jerome was famous for his edition of the Latin Bible known as the Vulgate, and he was widely regarded in the Middle Ages for his commentary on scriptural texts. In fact, he was so common and so popular that his copies of his texts became known as like the dime novels of the medieval era. There were so many of them everywhere that the vellum they were written on was more valuable than the text itself. So that vellum was cut up and reused to make new books. And this is what happened to my fragment and MS3. Once I had my identification, I contacted an expert in the field of fragment research, Dr. Eric Johnson at The Ohio State University, and he was able to date my fragment to the 12th century, which means that the Jerome commentary was written down before the Magna Carta was even signed, and then it was cut up and reused before Columbus made contact with the Americas. That also means that from page 3 to page 4, there is a gap of over 300 years. My research has solved the mystery of the unidentified Endpapers. It has thrust UK into this emerging field of manuscript fragment research, which is the endeavor to find value in pieces of manuscripts and not just whole books. I myself have entered into a line of experts and minds fascinated by this book, from the monks and artisans who created it, to the owners who prayed with it, to the decades and generations of scholars who have puzzled over it for years. My discovery has become part of the history of this book, and future scholars will be able to build on what I discovered about MS3's Endpapers. The title of my presentation is Latin, Fragmenta ne Pereant, which means let not the fragments be lost. And this means that there is a vast sea of untapped knowledge in pieces of manuscripts hidden in books and libraries all around the world. And discoveries just like mine could only be a page turn away. Thank you.
So farmers face a unique lifestyle that causes a lot of issues in health that are not addressed by current research. So they live where they work. Their financial stability is based on the weather, based on what their crops are doing, and their livestock at the time, which, as you can imagine, can be rather stressful for them. There's a lot of unconventional workout. Excuse me, I'm battling Kentucky allergies. There's a lot of unconventional work hours. They are subjected to waking up early, staying up late, sometimes putting in as many as 18 hours of work in a single day to only do that again the next day. They also have, interestingly, a very high suicide rate as found by the CDC. And so that brings me to why we looked at the effects of sleep quality and quantity on mood and weight in older farmers. So when we gave the farmers these surveys, they answered questions that led us to depression scores and scores on their sleep quality and quantity. They also answered the simple, how tall are you and what is your weight? From that, we calculated BMI, which is a better understanding of how weight is distributed per height. 200 pounds looks a lot different on a 5-foot person than it does somebody that's 6 foot. So that allows us to understand how heavy this person is per their height ratio. And so what we found was that decreased sleep quality and quantity led to higher scores of depression as well as increased BMI scores. It also impacted the female farmers more than it did the male farmers, which was very interesting to note and allows us to focus our interventions on the female farmers more so than the male farmers because we know that they're at higher risk for suicidal issues. And so why does this happen? Why does sleep impact your mood and your weight? Well, one thing is hormone imbalance. Your hormones, they dictate everything that your body does. If you sleep wrong or you sleep too short amount of time for your body's needs, then your hormones are thrown off. This can cause increased appetite. It can cause increased cortisol levels, which causes weight gain. It can also cause you to not sleep more, which continues to perpetuate the cycle. Further research does need to be done in this area to understand the best relationship between sleep and depression and sleep and increased BMI. But for now, we know that as nurses, we need to educate our patients, we need to screen our patients, and we need to use online resources. So farmers are in our rural areas, and they don't have the access to healthcare that we have. They are in rural areas where geographically they struggle to get to healthcare. They also are self-employed, so many of them do not have the health insurance that we're used to having. Those online resources will allow us to reach those people. And in addition, we need to utilize the healthcare that we have available. Those physicians, doctors, nurses, and psychologists, anyone that can help us, need to be aware of this issue, and they need to know how to address the issue and what we're looking at as far as sleep and the weight gain and depression scales of our older farmers. Thank you.